Deep beneath a mountain of shadow, a new kind of evil was being hammered into existence. Gorthaur the Cruel, lieutenant of the Dark Lord Morgoth, strode through the fiery forges of Angband. His mission was to create a new breed of dark smiths, artisans bound not by craft, but by terror. Their task was to forge weapons of such profound malice, they would not just kill enemies, but shatter their very spirit. Yet this ambition came with a terrible risk. Should this dark endeavor fail to deliver ultimate power, Gorthaur would face the wrath of his own master. All the while, the anguished groans of captive elves echoed through the caverns, a constant reminder of the terrible price being paid for this power. By the end of this tale, you will understand how the greatest evils are not born, but meticulously crafted, and how a single spark of defiance can threaten to undo them all. We often hear of dark lords and great battles, but what of the workshops where evil itself is tempered? Where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? I always find it wonderful to picture this story unfolding for people in different corners of the world. What does it take for hope to survive in a place built to extinguish it completely? The first elf brought before the foul anvil was Celebrimbor, a master of his craft, now bound in chains. Gorthaur the Cruel did not ask for his cooperation. He simply laid out the tools and made the stakes terrifyingly clear. Demonstrate the secret techniques of your people, or watch those you sought to protect suffer unimaginable torments. The choice was a poison designed to shatter a noble spirit from within. With hands that trembled not from fear, but from profound violation, Celebrimbor lifted the dark hammer. The clang of that first strike was more than metal meeting metal. It was the sound of a soul being fractured, and from that fracture, something impossible bloomed. The blade he was forced to create began to glow with a soft, sorrowful light, humming a faint and mournful song. It was beautiful, and it was a testament to a craft that even this place of shadow could not fully corrupt. Gorthaur watched, his cold satisfaction warring with a flicker of unease. He had proven his dark smiths could produce power, but that power carried an echo of its maker's spirit, a light he could not extinguish. For Celebrimbor, the moment was a deeper damnation. He had preserved the lives of his fellow captives, but at what cost? By using his sacred knowledge here, he had not just bent to the enemy's will. He had given the darkness a blueprint, a precedent that would now be demanded of every skilled prisoner. His one reluctant act had bound him and all his kindred to the Forges of Angband, making them architects of the very weapons that would be used to conquer all they held dear. How does a person live with such a choice, knowing that every act of survival fuels the enemy's war machine? That mournful light in the blade was a small, private rebellion, but Gorthaur would not tolerate such defiance again. He shifted his strategy from breaking one will to exploiting a deeper vulnerability. He forced Celebrimbor to stand and witness as his fellow elves were dragged before the forges. Their suffering made a gruesome spectacle. The choice given was no choice at all. Teach the fundamental secrets of your craft to my orc smiths, or watch them endure torments that would extinguish their light forever. To save their bodies, Celebrimbor had to sacrifice a piece of their legacy. He agreed, and so began a terrible, unholy tutelage. Celebrimbor, the great artisan, found himself surrounded by brutish orcs. their minds incapable of grasping the grace or the soul behind the craft. He showed them how to heat the metal, how to fold it, how to quench it, but in their rough, hateful hands, every technique was twisted. Where an elf would impart a song of strength into the steel, an orc hammered in only malice. The Forges of Angband began to roar with a new, terrible industry. No longer were they producing a few sorrowful blades. Now they churned out a flood of crude, jagged swords and spears, each one radiating a palpable hatred. The very air grew thick with the stench of cheap, mass-produced evil. For Celebrimbor, this was a new and different kind of hell. Every lesson he gave, every basic principle he revealed, felt like a betrayal of his entire people. He would save a life today, only to arm the enemy that would take 1,000 lives tomorrow. The conflict within him was a constant, gnawing pain. Was he a protector, or was he a collaborator? His desire to shield the innocent was now the very engine fueling Morgoth's war machine. The shame of it was a heavier chain than any iron binding his wrists. And with this new, efficient production, Gorthaur's ambition swelled. His arsenal was growing, his army was being armed at an unprecedented rate. The success of this dark assembly line bred a hunger for something more, something truly catastrophic. In the smoky depths of the forge, amidst the clamor of countless hammers, the first, chilling whispers began to circulate. Whispers not of a simple sword or spear, but of a weapon of such immense and focused power, it could challenge the very foundations of the world. The pact forged in fear had not just spread knowledge, it had opened a door, and something far worse was now preparing to step through. The whispers in the forge gave way to a new and chilling directive. Under Gorthaur's cold gaze, the smiths were commanded to blend common iron with a shard of cursed meteoric ore, a material that seemed to drink the very light from the air. The moment the substances met in the crucible, the metal did not merely melt. It writhed, twisting as if in agony, and a low, hateful hum filled the chamber. This was no longer simple crafting. It was a perversion of creation itself, giving birth to an alloy with a malevolent life of its own. The result was a new, far darker grade of weapon. Blades forged from this substance did not just cut. They seemed to thirst for blood, their edges humming with a palpable hunger, but this power came at a terrible price. The unstable alloy fought its makers. During the quenching process, a newly forged sword might suddenly twist in the tongs, its searing edge slicing through the arm of an orc smith. Another might shatter without warning, sending shrapnel of cursed metal deep into the eyes and flesh of those nearby. The forges rang not just with the sound of hammers, but with the screams of the maimed. For Celebrimbor, this presented a torment far deeper than any physical chain. He alone understood the chaotic forces now at play. He saw a critical flaw in the quenching sequence, a single moment where a precise, deliberate error could cause the entire batch of unholy alloy to crystallize and become useless slag. To sabotage the process would be a direct act of defiance, a chance to stem the tide of this sentient evil, but the risk was absolute. Gorthaur was watching every step, his patience worn thin by the failures and the injuries. If Celebrimbor was caught, the retribution would not fall on him alone. Every elf in the cavern would be executed in a spectacle of unimaginable cruelty. His mind became a battlefield, weighing the value of a future without these horrific weapons against the certain, immediate death of everyone he sought to protect. This was no longer about survival or shame. It was a choice about what kind of evil he was willing to enable. By proving it could create weapons that desired to kill, the Forge had crossed a terrible threshold. Now, the only question was whether one captive elf had the courage to push back, knowing that the cost of failure was the annihilation of every last spark of light in that mountain of shadow. The heart of Angband pulsed with a new and insidious rhythm. The great central forge, a colossal construct of black iron and perpetual flame, began to whisper. It was not a sound heard with the ear, but one that seeped directly into the mind. For the orc smiths, these whispers were a simple, brutal encouragement, fueling their innate rage and making their hammers fall with a frantic, desperate speed. But for the elven captives, the effect was far more sinister. The whispers spoke in voices they almost recognized, promising rest, whispering lies of easy compliance, and twisting their deepest memories of home into reasons to simply let go. Gorthaur observed this phenomenon with cold, calculating eyes. He did not question its origin. He saw only a tool. He strategically rotated the elven smiths closer to the furnace, letting its psychic murmur slowly sand away their resolve. Productivity soared as a new, more terrible kind of weapon took shape, one that carried not just malice, but a soul-crushing despair. Celebrimbor felt the pull like a physical weight. It would be so simple to just listen, to let the whispers numb the agony of his choices. But he understood this was the final corruption, a surrender that would leave his body working while his spirit faded into nothing. So he built a fortress within his own mind. While his hands performed the motions of the craft, his inner self stood vigilant, fighting a silent, exhausting war against the furnace's lure. To any observer, he was the model of compliance, his work flawless, but this internal resistance created a new and profound isolation. The other elves, their wills slowly eroding, began to look at him with vacant eyes, no longer seeing a fellow sufferer, but a grim taskmaster who mirrored the enemy's relentless drive. He was alone, surrounded by those he was trying to save, who were now forgetting why they needed to be saved at all. The forge was no longer just a place of fire and metal. It had become a living entity, an active participant in their undoing, and with every weapon that left its fires, a little more of its corrosive whisper was sent out into the world, a poison for the soul that threatened to make the very concept of hope feel like a distant, foolish dream. The moment of decision arrived in a cascade of sparks and screaming metal. Celebrimbor, his mind a fortress against the whispering forge, saw his chance and took it. As the cursed alloy glowed white-hot, he deliberately quenched it a fraction too early, introducing a fatal brittleness into the swords. The result was not immediate. It was only as the blades cooled, their dark hum fading, that they began to pop and fracture like ice, crumbling into heaps of useless, crystalline shards. A profound silence fell over the forge, broken only by the hiss of dying embers. Gorthaur's wrath was not a storm, but a glacial tide. He did not even look at Celebrimbor. His gaze swept the line of captive elves and settled on one, a gentle craftsman named Leiron, who had often shared words of quiet comfort with Celebrimbor in the darkness. Without a word, Gorthaur's guards seized Leiron, dragging him before the central furnace. The message was exquisitely cruel. Your defiance has a price. but it is a price you will never pay yourself. Continue your sabotage, and you will watch every friend you have left be consumed by the very fires you seek to thwart. Celebrimbor stood frozen, the hammer feeling like a mountain in his hand. To continue his resistance was to sign Laeron's death warrant, and the warrants of all who remained, but to perfect his work, to pour all his genius into creating the flawless, hate-filled weapons Gorthaur demanded, was to arm the darkness with tools of unimaginable power. It was a choice between two kinds of damnation. One was swift and bloody, a final, brutal act of defiance. The other was a slow, soul-crushing collaboration that would ensure his legacy was one of conquest and ruin. He looked at Laeron, seeing not just fear in his friend's eyes, but a quiet, desperate plea for life. And in that moment, the rebellion changed. It could no longer be about grand gestures of sabotage. It had to become something subtler, more patient, and infinitely more dangerous. He would have to give the Dark Smiths what they wanted, all while searching for a weakness they could not see, a flaw so deep and fundamental that it would unravel their entire enterprise from within. The stakes were no longer about victory or defeat. They were about finding a way to save a single life today, while plotting to destroy an empire tomorrow. Could a masterpiece of evil be designed to fail, and could its architect survive long enough to see it break? The silence of the forge was shattered by the arrival of a new captive. It was a dwarf, his beard matted with grime, but his eyes blazing with a defiant fire. As he was chained to a workbench, he did not weep or beg. Instead, in gruff, hushed tones meant only for his immediate neighbors, he shared a story that spread through the caverns like a sudden, clean wind. He spoke of great alliances forming in the world above, of elven kings and dwarf lords uniting their armies under the banner of a high king, Fingolfin, to challenge the dominion of Morgoth himself. The whispers of this gathering host, this union of Midros, were a spark thrown onto the dry tinder of the elves' despair. For the first time in what felt like an age, the word hope was no longer a memory. It was a dangerous, tangible thing. This fragile hope, however, demanded action. A handful of the younger elven smiths, their spirits inflamed by the news, began to plot in the deepest shadows. Their plan was a desperate, hushed scheme to overpower a single guard patrol during a shift change, seize their weapons, and fight their way to the surface. They believed their moment of deliverance had finally come. Celebrimbor listened to their fervent whispers, his own heart torn. He saw the fierce light in their eyes, a light he had thought extinguished forever. But he also saw the brutal, calculated efficiency of Angband's security, the countless legions that stood between them and the open air. He warned them of the recklessness of their plan, urging caution and a more subtle path. They did not listen, seeing his counsel not as wisdom, but as the timidity of a spirit already broken by collaboration. The plot was executed under the cover of a simulated equipment failure. It was crushed in moments. The guards, anticipating such desperation, had been waiting. The ringleaders were not merely killed, they were made an example of, their fate so gruesome that it extinguished the newfound hope in the cavern as thoroughly as a bucket of water douses a candle flame. The conflict between that brief, soaring hope and the crushing reality of their situation left a void deeper than any before. Celebrimbor stood amidst the grim aftermath, the choice before him now terrifyingly clear. Clinging to feudal, Open resistance was a path that led only to slaughter and the erasure of every skilled hand that might one day make a difference. The door to simple escape had been slammed shut and bolted. His only remaining path was to channel his entire being, his every gesture and thought, into a more profound and patient subversion. He would have to become the perfect dark smith, earning Gorthaur's trust with his genius, all while weaving a fatal flaw into the very heart of his creations. The stakes were no longer about a single life or a single failed rebellion. They were about crafting a weapon so perfect, so essential to the Dark Lord's plans, that its eventual failure would bring an entire empire crashing down. The Forge's oppressive rhythm was broken by Gorthaur's chilling silence. He stood before Celebrimbor, his gaze stripping away all pretense. The time for crude blades and whispered despair was over. The lieutenant revealed his ultimate ambition, a weapon to eclipse all others, a device designed not merely to kill armies, but to channel the raw, corrosive power of Morgoth himself. It would be a conduit for the Dark Lord's will, a focus for his hatred that could scar the very world, and Celebrimbor, he declared, would be its chief architect. The demand was absolute. There was no request, only the stark reality of the task. To refuse meant the immediate and brutal execution of every remaining captive. To accept meant becoming the principal engineer of a world-ending device. With a soul that felt as brittle as the sabotaged blades, Celebrimbor agreed. He picked up a stylus and a slate, and he began the theoretical work. The first lines of the design were not just diagrams, they were chains, binding him irrevocably to the project and to the darkness he served. This initial act of compliance brought an immediate, poisoned reward. His rations improved, the guard's oversight lessened. He was given a semblance of trust, a larger cage within the vast prison. But this privilege came at a terrible cost. The other captives, who had once seen him as a fellow victim, now watched him with cold, unforgiving suspicion. Where they saw only collaboration, he saw a desperate gambit. He had to accept this bitter comfort, to play the role of the favored servant, if he was to have any chance of finding a way to subtly undermine the very weapon he was building. His every meal, every moment of unobserved thought, was now paid for with the trust of his own people. He was completely alone, trapped between the hatred of his captors and the contempt of his kin. The stakes were no longer about survival or a single act of rebellion. They were about how deep one must wade into evil to have any hope of destroying it from within. Could he design a key for Morgoth's ultimate power that would, at the crucial moment, turn in the lock and break? The furnace flames held a secret deeper than any metal. In the endless, grinding days, Celebrimbor's artist eyes began to perceive patterns within the fire that others could not. The chaotic dance of orange and crimson was not random. For fleeting moments, the flames would still, and within their heart, he saw images. He saw the great weapon completed, a spire of black iron pulsing with malevolent energy. He saw it unleashed upon the world, and in that same terrifying instant, he saw a single hairline fracture appear along its central conduit, a flaw that spread like a spider web until the entire structure shattered into a million dark shards. It was a vision of its destruction, a phantom chance of victory delivered by the very source of his torment. This possibility ignited a dangerous and specific hope within him, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. But the visions came at a cost. To hold them in his mind, to focus on the intricate details of that future fracture, required a concentration that pushed his spirit to the brink. Each session left him mentally drained, his thoughts frayed, and his grasp on the present moment growing tenuous. He now faced a terrible internal conflict. Should he pour his energy into pursuing this phantom loophole, a chance seen only in fire and shadow, or should he focus entirely on the tangible, grim reality of his work, ensuring his survival and that of the other captives through perfect, soulless compliance? To chase the vision was to risk his sanity and the fragile trust he had built. To ignore it was to abandon what might be the only key to saving everything. This was no longer a simple choice between defiance and collaboration. It was a gamble on a future only he could see, a gamble where the price of being wrong was the complete unraveling of his mind and the extinction of his last desperate hope. The final hammer fell on the black mace with a sound that swallowed all others. It was complete. The weapon did not reflect the forge's fire, but drank it, leaving a chill void in the air around it. To the eye, it was a masterpiece of malevolent art, its surface a swirl of captured shadows, and deep within its core, invisible to any but its maker, lay a single, fragile crystal, a seed of failure Celebrimbor had inlaid with a craftsman's terrified precision. Gorthaur himself took the mace from the anvil. He did not test it on simple iron or stone. He ordered a captured spirit of fire, a minor elemental, to be brought forth. When he swung the mace, the weapon did not strike the creature. It simply unraveled it, pulling its essence apart into wisps of fading heat and a silent, final scream. The Dark Lieutenant's satisfaction was a physical force in the chamber. He turned his gaze to Celebrimbor, and the praise that followed was not a reward. It was a brand, searing the elf with the identity of a loyal and brilliant servant of the enemy. In that moment, Celebrimbor held his breath. He could speak. He could reveal the flaw, shatter the weapon on the anvil himself, and declare his defiance. It would be a glorious end for a few seconds. Then he and every other captive would be torn apart. His secret, his patient gamble, would die with him, and the next version of the weapon would be built without his sabotage, truly perfect and unstoppable. The choice was agonizing. To act now was to die for a principle. To remain silent was to live as a collaborator, to allow this horrific tool to enter Morgoth's arsenal, and to pray that his hidden flaw would hold until a moment of true consequence. He had placed a seed of hope inside a tool of absolute despair, and now he had to let that despair loose upon the world, trusting that the seed would one day sprout. It was the heaviest burden a soul could carry. How do you live with yourself, knowing the evil you have unleashed, and betting everything on a fracture no one else can see? The silence of the forge was never truly silent, but one figure learned to listen to its lies. The dwarf captive, Gorthaur, had watched Celebrimbor for weeks, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He saw the elf's hands tremble not from fear, but from the intense focus of his secret work. He saw the way Celebrimbor's gaze would linger a moment too long on a single, hidden component, a look not of pride, but of profound dread. One night, as the shift changed and the guard's attention waned, Gorthaur moved his workbench closer. He did not speak of hope or rebellion. He spoke of stone. He explained in a low, gravelly whisper how the strongest granite can be split not by a mighty blow, but by driving a small, precisely shaped wedge into a hairline crack and tapping it with just the right rhythm. He offered his people's ancient knowledge of hidden fractures, of how to make a weakness look like a natural grain in the material, undetectable until the moment of greatest stress. It was a proposal and a test. Celebrimbor faced a choice more intimate than any Gorth or had ever forced upon him. This was not a demand made under threat of torture. It was an offer of partnership, and accepting it would make their conspiracy real. To trust the dwarf was to share the burden of his terrible secret, but it was also to multiply the risk. If Gorthaur was a spy, or if he simply broke under interrogation, the consequences would be apocalyptic. Their deaths would be the least of it. Every captive would be executed, and the weapon would be rebuilt without its hidden flaw, becoming truly perfect and unstoppable. Yet, the potential reward was the only thing that mattered. With the dwarf's understanding of hidden stresses and crystalline structures, they could weave the fatal weakness so deeply into the weapon's core that not even Gorthaur's piercing gaze could find it. Celebrimbor looked into Gorth's steady, unyielding eyes and made his decision. He nodded. In the stolen moments between the clang of hammers, an elf and a dwarf, two races often at odds, began to collaborate. Celebrimbor described the metaphysical stresses the weapon would need to endure, and Gorth suggested how to disguise the flaw as an aesthetic flourish, a seemingly random swirl in the dark metal that actually followed a precise, weakening pattern. Their conspiracy was no longer a solitary, desperate hope. It was a tangible, shared threat to the power of Angband, a secret alliance hammered out in the heart of the enemy's greatest stronghold. The weapon was now stronger in its apparent perfection, and its hidden failure was more certain than ever. But so too was the danger, for the fate of their fragile hope now rested on the integrity of a bond forged in shadow, a trust that, if broken, would doom the world. Gorthaur's patience finally snapped. Without warning, he turned his full attention upon the weapon, his will a physical force of pure malice that struck the dark mace like a hammer of shadow. The chamber itself seemed to groan under the pressure. Celebrimbor's breath caught in his throat as he watched, his entire being focused on that one, fragile crystal hidden deep within the metal. The weapon trembled violently, its dark surface rippling as if it were liquid. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the entire structure would fly apart, revealing his treachery for all to see. But then the shuddering ceased. The mace held, its form intact, though a faint, dissonant hum now lingered in the air where there had been only silence. Gorthaur's cold satisfaction was gone, replaced by a slow, calculating stillness. He had expected the weapon to absorb his hatred effortlessly. That it had resisted, that it had trembled, suggested a flaw not of power, but of obedience. His gaze, heavy with fresh suspicion, slid from the mace and settled on Celebrimbor. The narrow escape from disaster had not earned the elf any trust. It had done the opposite. It had brought the full, crushing weight of the lieutenant's attention back upon him. Gorthaur immediately commanded that the final stages of the work be conducted under the gaze of twice as many guards, their orders to record every gesture, every hesitation. Celebrimbor was now trapped in a spotlight of scrutiny. He had to complete the weapon, knowing that any tiny error, any flicker of expression that betrayed his knowledge would mean discovery. How do you perfect a tool of evil under the watchful eyes of its master, when every correct step you take feels like a betrayal, and every safe move brings the world closer to ruin? The conflict was no longer about a hidden flaw. It was about performing the role of the loyal smith so perfectly that even a doubting tyrant would be convinced, all while the fate of everything rested on a weakness he had to protect with every fiber of his being. Gorthaur produced a small, obsidian vial that seemed to swallow the forge light around it. This, he declared, was the final ingredient, a liquid distilled from the very essence of terror itself. The weapon would not be quenched in water, but in this concentrated shadow. He held the vial out, not to an orc, but to Celebrimbor. The act was deliberate, a final, cruel masterstroke. By forcing the elf's own hand to perform this ultimate corruption, Gorthaur placed the weight of the entire creation squarely upon his shoulders. Every ounce of its evil would now be his direct responsibility. With a heart that felt like stone, Celebrimbor took the vial. The moment he unstoppered it, a profound and unnatural cold radiated from the liquid, and the constant roar of the forges died into an absolute, suffocating silence. He tilted the vial over the searing mace. The liquid shadow did not sizzle or steam. It was consumed, drank by the dark metal, as if the weapon were a living thing, finally taking its first breath. And as it did, Celebrimbor felt a wave of pure malice not just wash over the mace, but seep back through the tongs and into his own spirit. It was a violation more intimate than any chain or threat, a staining of his very essence. His hand tightened on the tools. This was the moment. He could, with one desperate swing, dash the nearly complete weapon against the anvil. It would be a glorious, final act of defiance. But the consequence was absolute. He would die, every other captive would die, and Gorthaur would simply begin again, having learned from this attempt, creating a perfected version without any flaw. To complete the act was to become the architect of a fully realized evil. To destroy it now was to sacrifice every life for a symbolic victory that would ultimately ensure the darkness won. His fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the magnitude of the choice. He had to let the evil be born, to give it its full and terrible form, so that the seed of failure he and Gra had planted would have a chance to grow. The mace solidified, its surface now a perfect, lightless black, and the silence broke as it began to hum with a low, hungry frequency. The weapon was alive, and its creation was now a part of him forever. The instant Gorthaur's hand reached for the humming mace, the forge erupted. Gra, with a roar that shook the very stones, had toppled a crucible of molten slag directly into a channel of quenching water. The resulting explosion was not one of fire, but of scalding steam and shrapnel, a sudden, blinding fog that filled the cavern. In that single, chaotic heartbeat, Gorthaur recoiled, his attention torn between his prize and the unexpected assault. All eyes turned toward the cacophony, all except for Celebrimbor's. He saw his opening, a fleeting window of absolute clarity in the madness. His gaze locked onto the mace, still resting on the anvil, and the one tiny point on its surface where he knew the hidden crystal lay. To strike it now was to reveal his treachery to everyone. The diversion would be for nothing, and his death would be immediate and agonizing. But to do nothing was to let this perfected evil pass into the Dark Lord's hand, his one chance to break it lost forever. There was no time to weigh the consequences, only to act. He snatched up a heavy hammer, its familiar weight now feeling alien and terrible in his grasp. With a cry that was part anguish and part defiance, he brought the hammer down not on the weapon itself, but on that one precise point of its invisible weakness. The sound was not a clang of metal, but a sharp, high crack, like a mountain of ice splitting deep within. A web of brilliant white light erupted from the point of impact, spider webbing across the mace's dark surface. The low, hungry hum of the weapon twisted into a shrieking wail of rending power. The confrontation was no longer a hidden conspiracy. It was a declaration of war made in a single, irrevocable blow, and the entire forge held its breath for the retaliation that was sure to come. A spider web of blinding white light pulsed from the crack in the mace, and the weapon's shriek became a physical force, shattering anvils and sending tools flying like deadly shrapnel. The forge was no longer a place of controlled industry, but a vortex of wild, screaming energy. The very air twisted, pulling loose stones from the ceiling and snatching up orc smiths to hurl them into the seething maelstrom. The perfected evil they had labored to create was now turning on its creators with an indiscriminate hunger. Gorthaur stood frozen for a single, crucial moment, his cold eyes fixed on the unstable weapon. His prize was right there, trembling on the anvil, its power bleeding out in chaotic, destructive waves. To seize it now was to claim a raw, untamed force that could potentially still be mastered. But to reach for it was to step into the heart of the storm. The decision was written in the sudden tension of his body. He would not risk himself. With a snarl of pure frustration, he recoiled, barking orders to his guards to contain the blast, to save whatever they could. But his command was lost in the apocalyptic roar. His choice to preserve his own skin over his master's ultimate weapon unleashed a new level of chaos as the leaderless guards scrambled in panic, some fleeing, while others were simply unmade by the raging energies. In that storm of unleashed power and desperate fear, a single, clear thought cut through Celebrimbor's mind. This was not the end. It was the beginning of the escape he and Gra had barely dared to hope for. The forge was tearing itself apart, and in that destruction lay their only path to freedom. The world dissolved into a screaming, white-hot chaos. Through the shattering anvils and the panicked cries, Gra's voice boomed one last time, not in fear, but in fierce command. He did not say goodbye. He shoved Celebrimbor with all his dwarven strength, sending the elf stumbling backward toward a newly opened fissure in the cavern floor, a wound of bubbling magma and raw steam torn open by the weapon's explosive backlash. Then Gra turned, planting his feet squarely between Celebrimbor and the advancing Gorthaur, his own body becoming a final, unbreakable shield. The sacrifice was instantaneous and absolute. In that single, selfless act, Gra traded his own life for a sliver of a chance, a fleeting possibility of escape that Celebrimbor had never dared to believe in. The emotional conflict was a blade sharper than any forged in that cursed place. To survive now meant to accept this gift, paid for with the blood of a friend. To hesitate, to turn back in a futile attempt to fight, would be to render Gra's final, noble act completely meaningless. The guilt was a heavier chain than any he had ever worn. His survival was now a debt, an obligation that crushed his spirit even as it offered him freedom. There was no time for a proper farewell, no moment for gratitude. With the forge collapsing around him and Gorthaur's wrath focused on the defiant dwarf, Celebrimbor made the only choice that could honor the sacrifice. He turned his back on the only ally he had left, and without a second look, threw himself into the searing, unstable fissure. It was not an escape. It was a fall into pure, terrifying uncertainty, a leap fueled by grief, and a desperate promise to make one friend's death mean something. He chose to carry the burden of survival, a burden now forever stained with the cost of that one irreplaceable life. The weapon's ultimate fate was swallowed by the roaring chaos behind him, its final failure or triumph, now a mystery for another day, while Celebrimbor fell into the heart of the mountain, a lone spark of defiance cast back into the darkness. The molten rock did not burn him, but cradled him in a searing embrace. He tumbled through a world of fire and shadow, the roar of the collapsing forge fading into a deep, subterranean rumble. When he finally clawed his way onto a shelf of blackened rock, he was utterly alone in the absolute silence of the underdeeps. The volcanic tunnels stretched before him, a labyrinth of jagged stone and glowing vents, with no light from the world above to guide him. Here, in the relative safety of total isolation, he was truly free from Gorthaur's chains. Yet this freedom was its own form of prison, a profound separation from everything that mattered. He could remain hidden, surviving in the deep dark, safe from immediate pursuit, but to do so would be to make Gris' sacrifice meaningless. The need to warn the elven kingdoms of the weapon's existence and of the terrible industry still thriving in Angband was a fire in his own spirit that outburned the surrounding magma. The choice was a brutal calculus. To seek a path upward was to risk recapture and a fate far worse than his first captivity. To stay was to condemn the world above to face a perfected evil unprepared. With a final glance into the crushing darkness behind him, Celebrimbor chose to press onward. He turned his face toward the treacherous, unknown ascent, a single figure embarking on a desperate journey with no map, no supplies, and no guarantee that he would ever see the stars again. His only compass was the memory of a dwarf's last stand, and the terrifying knowledge that the fate of countless lives now rested on his ability to navigate a path that might not even exist. The hammer felt impossibly heavy in his grip. It was the same simple tool he had used to strike the fatal blow against the dark mace, and now it was the only thing he carried from the Forges of Angband. Every time his fingers tightened around the worn handle, he did not just feel wood and iron. He felt the ghost of Gris' final shove, the blinding flash of light from the cracking weapon, and the crushing weight of his own complicity. It was an anchor to the very horror he was fleeing, a constant reminder that his freedom was bought with a friend's blood. He needed it to survive, to break through walls of soft rock and carve handholds in the sheer, volcanic stone. Yet each practical swing felt like a reopening of a spiritual wound. Was this the tool of his salvation, the instrument of his one defiant act, or was it a permanent mark of his shame, the very object that had made him the architect of a terrible evil? The conflict was a constant echo in the dark, a question with no answer. He could have discarded it, left it lying in the ashes of some deep tunnel to lighten his burden. But to let it go would feel like abandoning Gris' memory, like denying the terrible cost of his escape. So he chose to cling to it, to let its weight solidify his resolve with every difficult step. This hammer, a symbol of both his greatest failure and his only hope, would be his companion until the end. His mission was no longer a vague need to warn the world. It was a debt, hammered into his soul with every strike against the unyielding stone, a promise that he would see this through or die trying. How do you carry the very thing that represents your deepest regret and transform its weight into the strength to move forward? The tunnels began to groan around him. It was a deep, grinding sound that vibrated up through the soles of his feet, a sensation far more terrifying than the silence. The unstable energy from the shattered mace was not contained. It was bleeding through the mountain's roots, shaking the foundations of the world itself. Jagged cracks splintered across the volcanic walls, and the air filled with the sharp, percussive sound of falling stone. This was no longer a simple escape. It was a race against the very environment, a landscape turning vengeful, intent on burying him and his secret deep within its heart. Every muscle screamed as he pushed his body to its absolute limit, scrambling over shifting rock and ducking as fist-sized stones hailed down from the trembling ceiling. The mountain was actively trying to kill him, a final, geological extension of Gorthaur's will. How do you outrun a world that is collapsing on your heels? His lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but the memory of the forge, of Gr's sacrifice, was a whip at his back, driving him forward through the choking dust. Then he saw it. Ahead, the tunnel forked. One path sloped downward into a wider, seemingly more stable cavern. The other was a near vertical shaft, a narrow chimney of rock that clawed its way upward, and at its very zenith, a pinprick of faint gray light. The choice was a brutal gamble. The lower path offered temporary safety from the immediate cave-in, but it led deeper into the dark, perhaps into a dead-end tomb. The shaft was a treacherous climb, a sheer test of strength, with no guarantee he could reach the top, and the tremors made it a death trap, likely to crumble in his grasp. Yet that faint light was the first real promise of the surface he had seen since his fall. It was hope, and it was a target. With a final, desperate glance at the collapsing tunnel behind him, he made his decision. He would not be buried alive. He would risk the fall. He leapt for the first handhold, his fingers finding purchase on sharp, unstable rock. The climb was a new kind of agony, each pull upward a battle against gravity and the shivering mountain, every second expecting the entire shaft to give way and send him plunging back into the abyss. The cold air was a blade in his lungs. Celebrimbor lay on the jagged slope, his body racked by the simple, agonizing act of breathing. For years, his every breath had been a toxic cocktail of sulfur, soot, and despair. Now the clean, sharp wind of the surface world felt alien and violent, scouring his throat with a purity he had forgotten could exist. It was a staggering shock, a sensory overload that left him trembling on the stone. Above him, the sky was a vast, terrifying expanse of deep indigo, dusted with stars whose light was not consumed by shadow. The silence was not the dead, suffocating quiet of the deeps, but a living stillness filled with the whisper of wind over rock. Every instinct screamed for him to stay here, to simply lie beneath those impossible stars and let his ravaged spirit absorb this new reality. He had escaped. He was free, but the memory of Gr's sacrifice was a brand on his mind, and the image of that dark mace, even cracked, was a phantom weight in his heart. Rest was a siren's call, but his warning was a fire that would not let him rest. He could not afford the luxury of recovery. His mission was a debt that demanded immediate payment. Pushing himself up on trembling limbs, he forced his gaze to the heavens. He was a master smith, and like any good craftsman, he knew how to read his materials. The stars were his map now. He searched the constellations, his artist's eye, recognizing the familiar patterns of Valacirca, the sickle of the Valor, and the steadfast flame of Helluin. Their positions told him a stark truth. The hidden kingdoms of the elves lay to the west, but a vast, treacherous plain of open land stretched between him and any potential sanctuary. To go west was to commit to a long, exposed journey, a race across open country where he would be a stark silhouette against the horizon for any pursuing eyes from Angband. He could head north, toward the relative cover of the Iron Mountains, but that was a longer, more circular route, one that would cost him precious time. The conflict was immediate and brutal. Safety for himself, or speed for the world. He looked once more at the cold, clear stars, then down at the hammer still clutched in his raw hand. There was no real choice. He turned his face to the west, toward the distant, unseen realms of his people, and took his first unsteady step into the open, leaving the mountain's shadow behind. He was a fugitive under an infinite sky, with nothing but a memory and a warning to keep him moving. The wind carried the scent of ash and spoiled earth. Under the thin light of the stars, Celebrimbor saw a land twisted by malice. Where great forests once stood, only skeletal trees remained, their branches clawing at the sky like broken fingers. The rivers ran sluggish and gray, and a profound silence lay over everything, as if the very land had forgotten how to breathe. This was the work of the forges he had served, the blight spread from the very tools he had helped to create. His journey was not across a wilderness, but through a graveyard. He was moving through the consequences of his own forced labor, and the weight of it threatened to crush his spirit more than any mountain of stone. He had to remind himself with every step that his warning was the only chance to prevent this desolation from consuming the entire world. The need for speed was a fire in his blood, but the land itself taught him a brutal lesson in caution. One evening, as he prepared to cross a barren ridge, the guttural shouts of an orc patrol echoed from the valley below. He froze, his body flattening against the cold ground with an instinct born of long captivity. He watched them pass, a dozen armored figures moving with a purpose that spoke of organized search patterns, not mere random patrols. His escape had not gone unnoticed. Gorthaur's nets were being cast wide. This single, terrifying encounter forced a terrible conflict upon him. The most direct route west was now a gauntlet of such patrols. To continue on that path was to gamble his freedom and his message on the slim chance of remaining unseen. The desire to run, to sprint toward his goal, was a physical ache. But the necessity of stealth was a cold, hard truth. He could not fail now. He looked from the open plains to the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Gorthaur to the north. The mountain path was longer, far more treacherous, and would test his already exhausted body to its absolute limits. It promised cold, starvation, and the sheer physical danger of cliffs and crevices. But it also promised cover and a smaller chance of meeting the enemy. The choice was a torment. One path offered a quick death, the other, a slow and grueling one. With a heavy heart, he turned his back on the direct route, and began the arduous climb into the high passes. His freedom, so newly won, now depended on his ability to endure a different kind of prison, one of ice, rock, and agonizing slowness. Every painful step upward was a prayer that his strength would last long enough for his warning to matter. A distant flicker of orange light pierced the deep blue of the twilight. Then another and another, until a small constellation of campfires glowed on the far horizon. It was an elven outpost. The sight struck Celebrimbor with a force that momentarily stopped his heart. This was it, the end of his journey, the destination he had carved toward through rock and despair. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, half-choked cry that was part sob, part victory shout. All the pain in his limbs, all the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones, vanished in that single, electrifying moment. He broke into a desperate, lurching sprint, his body moving on a will that was no longer entirely his own. He did not see the treacherous ground under his feet, nor did he consider the shadows from which he emerged. He saw only the fires, the symbol of home and salvation. His charge across the final stretch was a blur of stumbling feet and ragged breath, a final mad gamble for deliverance. The shout that rang out was sharp and clear, an elven command to halt. He barely heard it. He staggered forward another few steps, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of supplication, before his legs finally gave way and he collapsed to his knees just inside the perimeter. Strong hands seized him, hauling him upright. He looked into the faces of his captors, his own people, and saw only cold suspicion and hardened vigilance. They saw a gaunt, skeletal figure clad in rags, his skin and hair permanently stained with the soot of the forges, his eyes wild with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. He was a creature of the Shadowlands, a monster stumbling from the dark. They did not see the master smith, the grandson of Fissure. They saw a threat. His warning, the vital message that had cost him everything, died in his throat as they bound his hands with ruthless efficiency. The cruel irony was a physical blow. He had survived the pits of Angband, outrun a collapsing mountain, and crossed a blighted land, only to be captured by the very people he had raced to save. His credibility was less than zero. If he shouted his identity now, in this chaotic moment, they would think it a cheap trick, a lie spun by the enemy. He had to choose his next words with the care of a man diffusing a live explosive. One wrong move, one desperate, poorly phrased plea, and they would dismiss him as a madman or a spy, locking him away while the very doom he described marched ever closer. His salvation had arrived, but it was holding him at spear point, and the fate of the world now hinged on his ability to prove he was not the monster he appeared to be. The rough hands of the guards did not relent as they dragged him into the commander's tent. Before him stood an elf lord, his armor unscarred, and his eyes holding a judgment as cold as the mountain peaks. Celebrimbor knew this was his only chance, a single moment to bridge the chasm between the monster they saw and the master smith he was. He did not beg or proclaim his name. Instead, he spoke of craft. His voice, raw from disuse, described the secret quenching song of the Noldor, a harmonic resonance only a true artisan would know, used to set a molecular piece within a blade that no eye could see. He described the precise angle for folding star iron to capture the light of Tulperion within the metal. These were not secrets written in any book. They were truths passed from master to apprentice in the Forges of Tyrion, long before the world was broken. The commander's cold gaze did not warm, but it did sharpen with a flicker of stunned recognition. The broken wretch before him was weaving a tapestry of knowledge so profound and so private it could not be faked. In that breathless silence, Celebrimbor delivered his frantic warning, his words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. He spoke of the master weapon, the dark mace designed to channel Morgoth's own will, and then, with a terrifying finality, he revealed everything. He laid bare the precise nature of the flaw he and Gorthaur had engineered, the single, fragile crystal placed at the confluence of its metaphysical stresses, the exact frequency of harmonic vibration that would cause the entire structure to cascade into failure. This was not just a warning, it was a schematic for its destruction. The atmosphere in the tent shifted irrevocably. He was no longer a prisoner to be questioned, but a strategist offering a critical tactical advantage. The commander now faced an impossible choice: to risk the mustering of their forces, to launch a preemptive assault on the very gates of Angband, based solely on the word of this one broken soul. Celebrimbor saw the hesitation, the weight of thousands of lives in the balance, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a passionate, intense whisper. He argued not for revenge, but for necessity. He painted a picture of that weapon, even cracked, being stabilized and perfected, becoming an unstoppable tide of darkness. He made them see that this was not a chance for glory, but the last, fleeting opportunity to exploit a weakness that would not last. The fate of armies now rested in his hands, not as a smith, but as the only person in the world who understood how to unmake the evil he had been forced to build. Could a strategy born in the heart of the enemy's forge be trusted to save them all? The debate that followed was not a quiet council, but a storm of fear and suspicion. Voices rose in the torchlit tent, some arguing that Celebrimbor's tale was a poisoned gift, a deliberate lie crafted by Gorthaur, or to lure their finest warriors into an ambush. Others saw only the ravings of a mind shattered by unspeakable torment, a broken soul whose warning was a phantom born of pain. The High King listened, his face a mask of grave uncertainty, the weight of every life in his command resting on his judgment. Celebrimbor watched the hope he had carried so far begin to crumble before him, not in the forges of the enemy, but in the hearts of his own kin. He knew then that facts were not enough. He had to make them feel the reality of Angband. He stood, his voice cutting through the clamor, and he did not speak of strategy or troop movements. Instead, he described the inner workings of that mountain of shadow. He recounted the precise, sickening rhythm of the great hammers, the way the very air thickened with despair near the central furnace. He explained the weapon's corruption not as a magical force, but as a tangible engineering principle, a perversion of craft where malice was hammered into the metal's very structure, making it thirst for life the way a desert thirsts for rain. He made them understand that this was not a sword to be met in battle, but a tool to unravel the world itself. His horrific, intimate detail was the final, terrible proof. The council fell silent. The theoretical risk had become a visceral, immediate threat. The conflict was now starkly clear. A cautious strategy meant waiting, gathering more allies, and potentially facing a perfected, unstoppable weapon. A swift, decisive strike was a desperate gamble, a headlong rush into the enemy's strongest fortress, based entirely on the word of one traumatized elf. The High King looked from the fearful faces of his lords to Celebrimbor's resolute, ashen features. He saw not a madman, but a craftsman who had held the blueprint for doom in his hands and had chosen to break it. The decision was made. They would not wait for the storm to gather. They would launch a targeted strike, a spear thrust aimed directly at the heart of the Forges of Angband. It was a choice born of terrifying necessity, committing their entire force to a perilous mission whose only map was the haunted memory of the one who had escaped. The last of the twilight had faded when Celebrimbor stood before the War Council and made his demand. He would lead the strike force himself. No map, no second-hand description could guide them through the volcanic labyrinth to the chamber where the damaged mace was held. He alone knew the path, and he alone could identify the precise point of the weapon's hidden weakness. A murmur of unease passed through the gathered commanders, but no one could refute the terrible logic of his claim. When a sword was pressed into his hands, the weight of it felt alien and wrong. His fingers, so accustomed to the precise grip of a hammer, trembled around the hilt. This simple, physical act marked his return to a role he had long abandoned, transforming him from a captive smith back into a warrior. The elven soldiers chosen for the mission watched this transition with a kind of awe, seeing in his resolve a profound courage that ignited their own. For Celebrimbor, however, the feeling was pure dread. Every fiber of his being recoiled at the thought of returning to that mountain of shadow. He was the one who had built the horror they sought to destroy, and now he had to become the instrument of its ruin. The conflict was a chasm within him, a war between the artisan who understood creation and the warrior who must now embrace pure annihilation. To cross that chasm, he had to make a conscious, brutal choice. He buried the searing memories of chains and fire, the ghost of Gr's final shout, deep within himself. He locked away the trauma and focused solely on the task, the mechanics of the path, the location of the guard posts, the exact frequency needed to shatter the crystal. In that moment, he became more than just their physical guide. He became their moral compass, the living embodiment of the choice to face a self-made evil. The success of their desperate mission now hinged on the stability of a spirit that had only just escaped being broken forever. The volcanic stone still groaned under their feet, a constant reminder of the damage they had unleashed. Celebrimbor moved not as a warrior, but as a craftsman, reading the faults in his own material, his hands skimming the trembling walls to feel the vibrations no one else could detect. He led the elven strike force through the fissure he had once fallen from, a crack that felt like a reopened wound. Every choice was a gamble with their lives. A corridor that seemed stable would suddenly shudder, forcing them to backtrack. A path that appeared clear would echo with the distant, guttural shouts of an orc work crew, sending them scrambling into side tunnels choked with acrid steam. His knowledge was their only shield, a living map of instability and peril. He remembered which vents would belch scalding gas without warning, and which rock faces were mere shells over rivers of magma. This was not the bold charge of an army, but the tense, silent creep of a surgical strike, their progress measured in agonizing inches. The environment itself was a sentry, and every near miss with a collapsing tunnel or a patrol they barely avoided was a testament to Celebrimbor's terrible, hard-won expertise. He was guiding them through the dying convulsions of the mountain he had helped to wound. Each step forward, a deeper immersion into the nightmare he had sworn never to enter again. How do you lead others back into your own personal hell, knowing that one wrong turn will doom them all? The air itself was screaming. They emerged from the steam-choked tunnel into the vast cavern of the main forge, and the scene was one of apocalyptic ruin. The great anvils were twisted into grotesque shapes, half swallowed by flows of molten rock that pulsed with a sickly orange light. In the center of this chaos, surrounded by a cordon of frantic guards, the dark mace hovered above its shattered pedestal. It was no longer a solid object, but a nexus of wild, shrieking energy, a wound in reality that bled raw power, warping the air around it. And there was Gorthaur, his form a study in furious concentration, his will a visible shield as he fought to contain the very destruction his prize was unleashing. Celebrimbor did not hesitate. His voice cut through the din, not with a warrior's cry, but with the precise instruction of a master craftsman. He pointed directly at the epicenter of the maelstrom, at the web of white light still spidering across the mace's dark surface. "That is the flaw," he shouted. "Strike the heart of the light. Do not touch the dark metal." His command transformed the scene in an instant. This was not a battle for territory, but a race to complete a specific, delicate task in the middle of a storm. His elven warriors, understanding the stakes, surged forward, their blades clashing with the armored guards, who now fought with the desperate fury of those whose entire world was collapsing around them. Celebrimbor was forced to become what he had long refused to be. He raised his own sword, a tool of pure destruction, and began to fight his way through the very guardians of the forge he had once served. Every parry, every thrust, was a brutal step back into the nightmare. He was not just fighting orcs. He was fighting his own past, his own compromises, his own creation. The artifact he had been forced to build with such agonizing care now drew him in like a malevolent star, and the only way to destroy it was to embrace the violence he had sought to avoid. His journey had come full circle, from captive to saboteur to fugitive, and now, finally, to the warrior who had to personally shatter the evil he had unleashed upon the world. The hammer felt like an extension of his own fury. As his warriors held the line against Gorthaur's frantic guard, Celebrimbor broke through the cordon and lunged for the shrieking mace. He did not swing the sword in his other hand. He raised the heavy, familiar tool he had carried from the depths, the very hammer he had used to first crack the weapon's core. With a cry that tore from the deepest part of his soul, he brought it down on the same precise point, the nexus of the flaw he and Gorthaur had engineered. This was not a desperate tap. It was a blow fueled by every moment of torment, every compromise, and the memory of a friend's sacrifice. The crack did not just spread. It exploded. A wave of absolute silence erupted from the mace, a sphere of nothingness that did not destroy, but unmade. Where it touched, solid iron did not melt. It simply ceased to be. Stone pillars dissolved into fine gray dust. The very air itself was pulled apart, creating a terrifying vacuum that snatched the breath from their lungs. This was not an explosion of fire and force, but of pure, ravenous entropy. The foundations of the forge hall began to vaporize, the floor dropping away into a void that consumed everything it touched. The battle between elf and orc became instantly meaningless. There was no more enemy, no more ally. There was only the frantic, universal scramble for survival against a force that was systematically deleting the world around them. Gorthaur's cold composure finally shattered into raw panic as the ground beneath his feet disintegrated, forcing him to retreat from the prize he had sacrificed so much to control. Gorthaur did not look back. As the floor dissolved into screaming nothingness behind him, he turned and fled, a streak of shadow plunging into a deeper, more stable tunnel. His retreat was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a raw, selfish scramble for survival, an absolute abandonment of the forces still struggling in the forge. The orc smiths and armored guards, left without command or purpose, were swallowed by the expanding void. Their final, guttural cries were cut short as the unmaking wave touched them, erasing them from existence without a trace. The elven warriors, forewarned and nimble, scrambled back toward the fissure, their victory secured by the enemy's own catastrophic failure and their leader's cowardice. This was their triumph, a chance to escape the mountain with their lives and the knowledge that a great evil had been shattered, yet the taste of it was ashen. They had won the battle, but the war's chief strategist had slipped away. Gorthaur, the cruel architect of all their suffering, was already receding into the impenetrable depths of Angband, his knowledge and his malice intact. For Celebrimbor, watching the lieutenant vanish, this moment carved a bitter truth into his soul. He had unmade the weapon, but he could not unmake the mind that had conceived it. The immediate, tangible threat was gone, vaporized in a storm of its own making. But the deeper, more patient evil, the intelligence that had turned craft into a weapon and hope into a trap, had simply withdrawn to plot again. Some creations can be broken with a well-placed hammer blow, but an idea, especially an idea of such refined malice, is a ghost that no amount of force can ever truly kill. How do you measure a victory when the source of the poison remains, waiting to brew a new and deadlier strain? Get back, now. Celebrimbor's voice was not a suggestion, but a command, forged in the same fires that were now consuming the mountain. He stood like a rock in a raging river, shoving his warriors toward the narrow exit tunnel as the floor fell away in great, groaning sections behind them. He was the last, a solitary figure ensuring every other soul had a chance at life before he would even consider his own. This final, deliberate act of responsibility was the culmination of his entire harrowing journey, a choice to put the lives of others absolutely before his own survival. The consequence of that choice was a race against total annihilation. The great forge complex was not just collapsing, it was imploding, the ceiling crashing down into a churning, roaring sinkhole of molten rock and superheated slag. The very mountain was having a fatal heart attack, and they were fleeing through its dying arteries. The conflict was no longer against orcs or dark lieutenants, but against the physics of a failing world, a desperate scramble over trembling rock as the tunnel walls cracked and splintered around them. Celebrimbor felt the heat on his back like a physical hand, pushing him, the air itself burning his lungs. He saw the last of his warriors disappear around a bend ahead, and he knew he had one final chance. With a last, desperate surge of strength, he leaped across a newly opened chasm of fire, his body slamming onto the unstable ledge, just as the tunnel behind him sealed forever with a thunderous roar of falling stone. The choice to leap was an act of pure faith, a gamble on a future he could no longer see. The passage back to the forges, back to his torment, was now permanently sealed under a mountain of cooled slag and rock. The chapter of the dark smiths, closed by the very earth they had sought to corrupt. He lay on the cold stone, gasping, the sounds of the apocalypse finally muted. He had escaped Angband for the second and final time, but the cost of that escape was now written in the permanent scar upon the land, and in the silent, empty space where a friend had once stood. The air on the mountainside was a cold, clean shock after the furnace roar below. The elven warriors regrouped, their armor smeared with soot, their faces etched with the grim relief of survival. They turned their eyes toward the distant peak of Angband, where a new and permanent darkness now churned. It was not the old, brooding shadow, but a violent, seething cloud of ash and debris, the mountain itself vomiting forth the poisoned remains of its own heart. In the middle of this ashen victory stood Celebrimbor. He did not join their quiet talk or share in their weary looks of camaraderie. He simply stood, his gaze locked on the churning darkness, his body and clothes still covered in the fine gray powder of the forges. The ash was more than just grime. It was the physical residue of his prison, a consequence that clung to him as tightly as any memory. To the elves around him, he was the savior who had delivered them and unmade a great evil. But to himself, he was a living relic, a walking monument to that same evil. Every flake of ash on his skin felt like a brand, a permanent mark, proving that a part of Angband would always be with him. The internal conflict was a silent scream. He had won. He had destroyed the weapon and escaped with his life and the lives of others. Yet the cost was a weight that threatened to crush his spirit. Gur was gone. Countless other captives had perished in the long years of his collaboration, and he himself was no longer the elf who had been dragged into that mountain. He was something else, a soul that had been hammered and quenched in the foulest of fires. His life, his very identity, was now irrevocably defined by what had been tempered in those flames. He could scrub the ash from his skin, but he could never scrub the knowledge from his mind, or the shame from his heart. How do you return to a world of light when you know you carry a piece of the darkness within you? How do you accept a victory that feels more like a sentence? The churning cloud over Angband was not just the end of the forges. It was the birth of his own long, gray shadow, a constant reminder that some victories are not clean, and some saviors are forged in the very evil they set out to destroy. He did not go back to the forges of his people. Celebrimbor turned his back on the great elven cities, choosing instead the solitude of the blighted plains that stretched from the feet of Angband. His home became a simple watchtower of gray stone, overlooking a land still poisoned by the industry he had once served. The world was safer now, the immediate threat of the master weapon erased, but his own peace had been a casualty of that war. He did not craft beautiful things anymore, for the hammer in his hand now felt like an instrument of memory, not creation. His purpose was no longer to build, but to watch. His profound knowledge of the darkness, earned at such a terrible price, made him the perfect sentinel. He could read the subtle signs in the earth, a strange discoloration in a stream, or an unnatural silence among the rocks that whispered of some new, creeping malice. He had become a warden of the wasted lands, a living barrier against the return of the shadow he knew so intimately. The burden was a constant companion, as tangible as the ash that had once coated his skin. In the quiet of his watch, Two faces were always with him. One was the cold, calculating visage of Gorthaur, a reminder of the intelligence that still lurked in the deep places of the world. The other was the stern, determined face of Grot the Dwarf, his final act of sacrifice, a debt that could never be repaid. This memory was not a comfort. It was a weight, a permanent scar upon his spirit that fueled his endless vigilance. His life was a quiet testament to a painful truth. The greatest weapons against evil are not always forged in light. Sometimes they are the very tools of darkness, reclaimed and repurposed by those who have suffered under their weight. Celebrimbor had been such a tool, tempered in the fires of Angband, and then turned against his masters. He was forever changed, his soul marked by the shadow, but he was not broken. His watchful gaze remained fixed on the horizon, a silent promise that the next shadow to rise would find someone waiting, someone who knew its name and was ready to face it long before it could ever take shape.
you.